115 true at 5 knots. We have 2 Russian Su-24s currently conducting multiple passes.
What happens when Russia aims its guns at a $13.3 billion U.S. aircraft carrier? On July 19, 2025, a Russian destroyer accelerated to 28.4 knots, heading straight for the USS Thomas Hudner, while 4 Su-30SM fighters, armed with Mach 3 anti-ship missiles, roared off Olenya Air Base. Beneath the waves, a Kilo-class submarine steamed ahead, noisily, emitting 12 decibels above the surrounding sonar. On top of that, Russian radar locked onto the USS Gerald R. Ford, the most expensive and dangerous warship in human history. Over the next 60 minutes, 48 U.S. jets were launched at 47-second intervals, Growlers disabled Russian radars, and a Virginia-class submarine surfaced just 6.2 nautical miles from the Russian fleet, shocking their entire anti-submarine defense system. What followed was a perfect display of dominance and invisible force, one that left the Russian task force with no choice but to retreat silently and forced Moscow to lie to its navy. This is the price to pay for daring to provoke the U.S. fleet. 7:14 a.m. on July 19, 2025. In the icy expanse of the Barents Sea, 167 nautical miles north of the Norwegian coast, the guided missile destroyer USS Thomas Hudner, DDG-116, was cutting through 14-foot waves under low Arctic skies. The morning was supposed to be routine. Another leg of the USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group's Freedom of Navigation Patrol, reaffirming international rights in contested waters. But nothing about what came next would be routine. At exactly 07:16, the ship's SPY-6 radar lit up with a contact accelerating fast. The Russian destroyer Admiral Levchenko, previously loitering at 15 knots, now surging to 28.4 knots in under 63 seconds. That wasn't a patrol pattern. That was a vector, a direct one. Unbeknownst to the Americans, Moscow had just issued a silent directive. Intercept the Americans, force them to back down, show the world that Russia could dominate its northern front. But they picked the wrong target, because 148,000 tons of floating U.S. sovereignty was in these waters. The USS Gerald R. Ford, the most advanced aircraft carrier ever built, was not just a warship, it was a statement. Over 75 aircraft, 4 guided missile destroyers, and 2 nuclear submarines formed the steel phalanx surrounding her. Every inch of ocean in a 300-mile radius was under constant surveillance. Every sonar ping, radar sweep, and electronic emission was logged, triangulated, and relayed across real-time encrypted Link 16 networks. The Russians may have thought they were sneaking up on a lone destroyer. What they didn't realize is that they were already inside a battle space owned and watched by the most lethal naval force in human history. And it was only minute 3 of the confrontation. If you were the highest authority in the U.S. warship fleet, would you give the order to fire on them? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. It was 7:21 a.m. 7 minutes into the standoff, the Russians threw their first real punch. From Olenya Air Base, 220 nautical miles to the southeast, 4 Sukhoi Su-30SM fighters roared into the Arctic sky, fully armed with Kh-31P anti-radiation missiles and Kh-35U anti-ship missiles, each capable of Mach 3 strikes against radar systems and warships alike. Within 12 minutes, they would enter the 25 nautical mile defensive ring surrounding the USS Gerald R. Ford, the most sensitive bubble in all of NATO's Arctic defense doctrine. But Russia wasn't done yet. At 07:26, the Admiral Levchenko's fire control radar snapped on, targeting not the escort destroyers, but the Ford herself, a 13-story floating city worth $13.3 billion. It was a message written in microwave frequencies. We're willing to point a loaded gun at your capital ship. The tension spiked even higher when sonar operators aboard the USS Thomas Hudner picked up something disturbing. A Type 877 Kilo-class submarine, just 28,000 yards to the southwest, crawling at 3 knots through the thermocline. It wasn't hiding well. Its acoustic signature was textbook Russian diesel-electric. Loud, clunky, and 12 decibels over normal background noise. A sonar tech's version of waving a red flag underwater. At this point, the Russians were operating in 3 domains simultaneously: air, surface, and subsurface. But it wasn't coordination. It was chaos disguised as choreography. The Su-30s, already burning precious fuel on full afterburners to close the distance, began to buzz American warships, flying just 200 feet over the flight deck of the USS Thomas Hudner, enough to rattle antennae and send unsecured deck gear clattering. Still, the Americans held the line. No launch orders were given, no counterjamming, not yet, because the U.S. Navy doesn't react out of fear. It responds with strategy, and the Russians were walking, no, sprinting, toward a line they couldn't uncross. An order that could lead to World War III is given decisively. Before giving this order, please support us by liking and subscribing to the channel. 07:34 a.m., the order came down like lightning through a storm cloud. Launch the air wing. Within seconds, the flight deck of the USS Gerald R. Ford ignited into a coordinated inferno of steam, steel, and afterburners. 4 FA-18E Super Hornets from VFA 211. Fighting checkmates screamed off the deck, one every 47 seconds. Fully loaded with AIM-120D AMRAAMs, AIM-9X Sidewinders, and 2,000-pound JDAMs. They weren't launching a strike, not yet. They were showing the Russians what American readiness really looked like. Overhead, an E-2D Hawkeye orbited at 25,000 feet, watching the entire region through its AN/APY-9 radar, a system that could track 2,000 targets across 6 million cubic miles of sky. Every Russian aircraft, every missile, every vibration in the electromagnetic spectrum was now a digital dot in a shared picture. And that picture was getting crowded. At the same time, 2 EA-18G Growlers from VAQ-140 Patriots entered the battle space, activating their ALQ-249 jamming pods. Within 30 seconds, Russian radar screens began bleeding false returns. 4 American fighters became 12, then 20, then ghosts. The Su-30SM pilots, lacking AESA radars and real-time data links, had only one way to fight: voice commands and guesswork. The Super Hornets didn't just fly, they dominated. Their APG-79 AESA radars could track 80 targets at once, lock onto 20, and fire on 6 simultaneously, while updating every nearby friendly via Link 16. The Su-30s, by contrast, were locked into Soviet-era radar systems scanning back and forth like World War II searchlights. 07:41 a.m. A Russian fighter entered missile range. 1 Super Hornet locked on, tone solid. The AIM-120D, with a 100-plus nautical mile range, was ready to launch. But again, restraint, because the real attack was invisible. Down below, a Virginia-class submarine, silent for 8 days, glided just 5.8 nautical miles from the Russian destroyer. She'd been tracking the Kilo-class sub the entire time, matching depth, listening, logging signatures. If war broke out now, the Kilo would be gone in 12 seconds, the destroyer in 40. But this wasn't war. Not yet. It was a demonstration, a warning, and the Russians still hadn't realized. They were now outnumbered, outgunned, and outclassed in 3 dimensions. The final limit is about to be crossed. Don't leave yet. The tension is still behind. 07:46 a.m. Desperation makes people reckless. And that morning, over the Barents Sea, it made a Russian pilot suicidal. A Su-30SM, burning through the last of its fuel reserves, broke formation and dove directly at a patrolling FA-18E Super Hornet. It was a textbook thump. A high-speed pass meant to intimidate, used by aggressive pilots to rattle their opponents. But this wasn't the Syrian sky. This was Top Gun territory. The American pilot, a graduate of Naval Fighter Weapons School, didn't flinch. He rolled inverted, pulled a 6.5 G turn, and dropped right onto the Russian fighter's tail. Missile lock in 2.7 seconds. His helmet-mounted display lit up with infrared signatures of twin afterburners, glowing like lanterns in a cave. The AIM-9X Sidewinder was armed. Just one squeeze, but it never came. U.S. fire discipline held. At that same moment, 28,000 yards to the southwest, the Russian Kilo-class submarine made its fatal mistake, raising its snorkel mast to recharge batteries. That tiny move betrayed its position. Within seconds, the USS Thomas Hudner's sonar array pinned it down to within 14 meters of exact location. The contact was classified. Hostile. Probable type 877. Depth 118 feet. Course 147. Speed 3 knots. It had no clue it was already being tracked for over an hour. If the situation had turned kinetic, the RUM-139C VLAS rocks, an anti-submarine rocket that launches vertically before diving with a torpedo, would have turned it into twisted metal in under 14 seconds. But it wasn't over. 07:49 a.m. The Russian Admiral Levchenko crossed a red line. Her frigate MA radar ceased searching and locked directly onto the USS Gerald R. Ford. Fire control quality, beam focused, targeting data sharpened. This wasn't a searchlight. It was a loaded gun. Inside the Ford's Combat Direction Center, alarm protocols activated. But again, the U.S. response was precise, professional. Do not fire unless fired upon. Instead, every ship in the strike group silently updated its firing solutions. SM-6 missiles, SM-2s, CRAMs, and ESSMs, all locked in. The Russian radar held for 31 seconds, just enough to say, we could have, but not enough to trigger an American counterstrike. It was the most dangerous bluff in modern naval history, and the Americans had already called it. 14:32 p.m. July 19th, 2025. The North Atlantic sky erupted. In under 4 minutes, the USS Gerald R. Ford's catapults launched 48 combat aircraft, the largest single surge of American carrier power in the Arctic since the Cold War. Super Hornets, Growlers, and Hawkeyes filled the horizon like a mechanized storm front, each jet armed, fueled, and connected via Link 16 mesh network that made them one coordinated organism. The first wave was all business. VAQ-140's EA-18G Growlers hit the jamming switch on their next-gen jammer mid-band pods. Russian radar screens from the Levchenko to the far edge of the Kola Peninsula collapsed into chaos. Dozens of fake targets blinked in and out. Real aircraft vanished. Missile lock signals flickered and died. Fighter pilots couldn't tell ghosts from threats. Then came the low blow. 14:41 p.m., the USS New Hampshire, a Virginia-class attack submarine, surfaced 6.2 nautical miles from the Admiral Levchenko. Her sleek hull breached the water like a black leviathan, throwing spray over her sail and hatches. Russian lookouts screamed. Deck crews scrambled, but it was too late. The message was not subtle. This sub had been tailing the entire Russian task group for over 9 days. Their ASW helicopters, sonar buoys, hull-mounted sonar arrays, all failed. In real war, the Russian destroyer would already be at the bottom. And it wasn't even the scariest moment. American aircraft began close air maneuver drills directly in view of Russian fighters. Super Hornets climbed, rolled, inverted, and broke at 9G turns. While the Russian Su-30SMs, still struggling from fuel deficits and radar degradation, couldn't keep up. Their radars, operating on X-band mechanical arrays, had already been saturated. Their internal fuel tanks were hitting bingo levels, emergency reserves. One Russian pilot broke off, transmitting a fuel emergency. Another followed, then another. By 15:06, 5 Russian fighters disengaged simultaneously, heading back toward Russian airspace with barely enough kerosene to make it home. And then came the quiet part. At 16:23, Moscow issued a routine message through its Baltic Sea Fleet channel. Joint Arctic readiness exercise complete. Units withdrawing per plan. Everyone knew it was a lie. They hadn't come to practice. They came to provoke, to test, to intimidate. And they were leaving humiliated. The Ford strike group didn't fire a single missile, didn't launch a single strike, didn't cross a single line of escalation, and yet they had crushed an entire Russian intimidation campaign with power, with precision, and with poise. Because dominance doesn't always need a detonation. Sometimes it only takes one look across the deck at 48 fighters in full combat spread, and the silent understanding that if a shot had been fired, Russia wouldn't have survived the next 5 minutes. That's not war. That's ownership. The July 19th confrontation in the Barents Sea may never make front-page headlines or appear in wartime history books. No missiles were launched, No vessels sunk. Not a single life lost. But for those who understand the language of naval warfare, this was not a skirmish avoided. It was a battle won without firing a shot. Russia arrived that morning with the intention of testing American resolve. It brought destroyers, submarines, and frontline fighter jets, backed by directives from Moscow and a belief that they could push boundaries without consequences. But what they encountered was the cold efficiency of U.S. naval supremacy, refined over a century, hardened by war, and sharpened through relentless training and unmatched technology. The lesson? Deterrence is not declared. It is demonstrated. The U.S. Navy didn't need to launch a retaliatory strike. It only needed to show the Russians what would happen if they did. This event was more than a standoff. It was a masterclass in modern power projection. It revealed how data networks, coordinated strike wings, electronic warfare, and submarine stealth can shut down a multi-domain threat before it ever becomes kinetic. And perhaps more importantly, it showed the world and America's adversaries that restraint is not weakness. It is discipline, it is professionalism, and it is backed by firepower that no rival force can match in open waters. For citizens watching from afar, this isn't just a story of jets and warships. It's a reminder of the invisible guardians that protect freedom of navigation, global trade, and democratic principles every single day. The message is clear. America doesn't start wars, but if provoked, it will end them, decisively, completely, and without hesitation. That is the legacy of the U.S. Navy, and it just echoed across the Arctic.